Greetings all, this is Professor Theo shooting this video on oral interpretation, controlling the voice and the body. So what is oral interpretation? Well, before we used to have this class, Advanced Public Speaking, I used to teach a class called Oral Interpretation. And oral interpretation was sort of like public speaking meets theater. And basically what you would do is you would take these various texts and you would then put your own spin on those texts. You would interpret the text, analyze the text, and then you would figure out how to re-deliver the text without changing the text itself, but you could change the context based upon how you delivered it. And so now we no longer have that class, but we have Advanced Public Speaking. And I've simply taken the liberty to bring some of that into this particular class. And so I want to get into the notes which are found on Canvas. You can find this under oral interpretation. So we're going to start with the working definition of what oral interpretation is. I just gave you a loose definition. Here's a more specific definition. It says oral interpretations involves performing literature. So those are some key words. You're going to do some performing. You're not just simply speaking out the words, there's a level of acting, because now you're taking some words that someone else has written and now you are putting some emotion behind those words, but not necessarily the emotion that was originally intended. And it's a piece of literature, so for this speech you're not going to write your own speech. You're going to take something that's already been written. And in terms, it could be a speech, a poem, a song, a story. For this particular class, we're going to do an oral interpretation of a song. So a song that's already been written. You're going to perform it out loud in order to communicate meaning to the audience. All right? So the whole idea is you want to be able to communicate some level of meaning to your audience. It's important that we recognize that the original text was written by someone else. And it's safe to say that they had a meaning and purpose. That they had a meaning in mind when they wrote their literature, their book, their song, their poem. They knew what the meaning was. There's a particular calm theorist named Fisher who says that the meaning of a text is determined by the reader of the text. The meaning of a text is determined by the reader of the text. That's called the reader response theory. And we talked about that earlier, so the reading response theory. Fisher says when someone hears the text, when someone reads the text, they have liberty to interpret what that text means. But Ricoeur says no, we have the theory of distanciation. You know, we distance ourselves. Distanciation, sorry about that. Distanciation. So we distance ourselves from the text and we allow the author and the author's original purpose and original meaning to shine through. And we don't get to touch the text. The author wrote it for this particular reason. This is what the author meant, and that's the meaning. Well, in oral interpretation, you start thinking in terms of distanciation. We distance ourselves from the text. We analyze the text, who wrote it, why they write it, what was the purpose, what was the meaning, what was the feel. And then we begin to internalize that, and then we kind of switch our brains over to the reader response and say, okay, now what's my interpretation of the text? How do I think this text should be received? And then we have the liberty to perform the text based upon our new interpretation of it. We can't change the words. We don't rewrite the text. We don't take out words and add words. What we do is we change how we say things. For example, say if the text simply says, "That looks good on you." And someone comes and says, "Well, how does this look?" And then you read your line, "That looks good on you." You can read it matter-of-factly, "That looks good on you." You can read it as if you truly mean it. Oh, take out the part. "That looks good on you." Or you can say it in a way that isn't as flattering. That looks good on you. And the reason why I took out the part, because once again, you don't want to add or take away from the text. You're just looking at the words itself. But those three ways of saying it, one is just matter of fact. You're like, does it look good on you? Yes. One of it's like, yes. One of it's, yes. Which brings into doubt. So how we say it, our facial expressions, our voice, our inflection, all that stuff changes the context. That's oral interpretation. We take the text and then we do our own oral or spoken interpretation of that text, which changes the meaning to our audience. It says the interpreter analyzes the literature, which I talked about, so you got to break it down. You got to know in this original context what the author, who the author was, what the author meant, what they were portraying. Then we use our voice, and we then communicate based upon this new analysis that we've done. And we do it in order to make a connection between the audience and this new meaning. We're the bridge now. Here's the text. Here's the audience. We become the bridge, but we bridge it in a way that we don't bridge the original context to the audience. We take the original text, but we give it a new context as we bridge it over to the audience. And so here are just a couple key points that I've already broken down. I just want to make sure we're clear on this. Number one is text analysis. As you're seeing in this class, it's not simply about writing speeches, formulating speeches, but it's also important that we be able to analyze speeches. So we did a lot of this when we were talking about the rhetorical situation and things of that nature. Who wrote it? When was it written? What was the context? What did the author mean? Who was the audience? We need to know that when we look at this original text, this original song. Who wrote the song? What feeling were they trying to persuade? Were they angry? Were they happy? Were they sad? What was the context? Who was the attendant audience? All those things are important because it's easier to reinterpret something once you first interpret it. It's easier to reimagine once you've imagined and analyzed what was the original context. And now that I know this original context, now that I know the original feel and purpose and the audience, now I can better reimagine, reinterpret orally this new context, this new purpose, this new feeling. And so text analysis is very important. Next is interpretation. This is how the performer takes the text and then makes it their own. So here's what Dr. King said. How do I take the I Have a Dream speech and then make it my own? How do I reimagine? How do I take ownership of it? Changing the feel, changing the flow, changing the context, but not changing the text itself. And so I think about my wife who's a singer, and she'll often do this when she sings a cover of a song or when someone else does a cover of the song, and they'd be like, man, they made it their own. They own that. Meaning for a moment you forgot, about the original artist. One time there was a song on the soundtrack for Selma, which was the movie about Dr. King. And there was a song, I think it actually won a Grammy. It was Common and John Legend, this song called Glory. And they did their thing on this song. And then one time there was a going away party at the White House for the Obamas. And Common, who was on the original song, he reprised his role. But instead of John Legend, a singer by the name of Yolanda Adams sung with him. And when I say she killed it, she owned it, she made it her own, she sang it way, way, way better than what John Legend had done. To the point to where I bet going forward, people was like, no, we don't want Common and John Legend. We want Common and Yolanda to do it. She owned it. She didn't change the words, but when she sang it, she had some voice inflections and some vocal abilities that John Legend just simply doesn't have. And she made it her own. That's what we do in oral interpretation. We use our voice, our body, our facial expression, all of our being to make it our own. And then lastly, we want to utilize pathos. Pathos is one of the persuasive means or the artistic proofs, along with ethos and logos, not to be confused with logos. Logos as in the word, Logos is using logic to be persuasive, to get your point across. So we want to use pathos, which is using emotion. How do we utilize emotion to communicate? And so maybe there was a song that was an angry song. It was a soundtrack for a movie about war. It's an angry song. And now you're going to take that song and you're going to make it a happy song. You're not going to change the words, but because of you're smiling now instead of, and your voice inflections is maybe higher pitch instead of lower pitch, what you're doing with your body, you're going to utilize the happy emotion to portray that, communicate that to the audience. So one of the main things you can do in oral interpretation is to reimagine the pathos, reimagine the emotion. The original text had this emotional tone. When I reimagine and reinterpret it, I'm going to have this emotional tone. And we use that emotion to connect with our audience. All right? Now let's talk about some things that you can do with your voice, your vocal delivery, which is a very important part of oral interpretation. One is this, how we can use our volume, adjusting our volume. Sometimes we can speak softly to communicate something. And then we can raise our voice to communicate something different. So I think about my mom when I knew I was in trouble. Theo, get over here. Or Junior, get over here. Junior, get over here. Now she's yelling, I'm in trouble. Junior, get over here. Oh, that's the whisper of silence. I'm really in trouble. So you can use your volume to communicate certain things. Vary your intonation or your inflection, also known as your pitch. This is the highness and the lowness of your voice. So volume, if you want to have a different definition for volume, is the softness or loudness. Intonation, inflection, pitch is the highness or lowness of your voice. And you can communicate different things in that. I think about, in my opinion, the two greatest comedians, at least the funniest people I've ever seen, and they both were the masters of pitch. One was Richard Pryor and one is Dave Chappelle. Richard Pryor has since passed away, but he would always speak and he would get high pitch. And that's what Dave Chappelle would do sometimes also. And Chris Tucker. In Chris Tucker movies, whenever someone was screaming and thinking about the Rush Hour movies, they shooting at us, man! And his pitch goes up. So you can use pitch. Or it's funny if you ever saw into Marvel movies. So in Infinity War, when the Guardians of the Galaxy, when they found Thor, and then Star-Lord was having this competition with Thor about who was the toughest, whatever, and Star-Lord started lowering his voice, the pitch of his voice, and he started speaking like this, and his teammates was like, "Why are you speaking like that?" He's like, "This is how I always speak." He's like, "No, it's not." He understood, at least in his mind, the thought was, if I go a little bit lower voice, it's more masculine, it's more manly, it's more rugged. And so depending upon how you're interpreting the text, how you want to reimagine it, use pitch. Go high or go low. All right? Your speaking rate is very important. Maybe in the original context, the author, when they got to a certain part, it's designed for the text to speed up. And if you simply speed up at that same point, the audience is going to now continue to associate your interpretation with that original interpretation. If you're keeping the same pace, the same rhythm. So one of the easiest things you can do is just change the pace, change the rhythm. So if it's a faster pace piece in its original context, as far as how it was delivered, now you slow it down a bit. So I think about whenever I am preaching messages or even teaching in class, sometimes when I get excited about certain things and my rate counter goes fast. But then also, there's times when I really want you to know what I'm saying, so I have to slow it down. And I believe one of the best things I've ever done as a professor was to pull from my time as a spoken word artist. And what I learned in spoken word, things like rate, voice inflection, things of that nature were so important because you're taking this text. And if someone was to read the text out loud, not everything that you're saying is super creative. Because it's not just like normal poetry where it's made to be read. And when the reader reads it, you have all these metaphors and similes and personification, all these things. In spoken word, you have less of those. And what's important is how it's spoken, how it's delivered. So if someone was just to read it, they'd be like, this is all right. But when you deliver it the way you intend to deliver it, that's when it gives life. And so that speaking rate is important. So I would have pieces where I would speed up the rate, and I would have sections where I would slow things down, and all those added to the piece. Next, we have pauses. And we have two types of pauses. We have the good type, which is called live silence. Then we have the bad type, which is called dead silence. And live silence is the strategic pauses that you give, and you're normally doing it for two reasons. One, to build up anticipation, or two, to just simply give the audience time to soak in what you just said. And so going back to spoken word, I remember when I would do performances and open mics, and say if I did a punchline, and the crowd would snap or say, oh, and I wanted to stay on my rhythm, I would go to the next line. But if people are clapping, oh, that means half of them missed the next line. So I strategically started, if someone, claps up, I'll pause. Give them time, I'll soak that up, give them time to get their snaps out, and then I'll go to the next line. Or I may even repeat that line, and then go to the next line. So you strategically pause. Or maybe you're saying one of the most important things you can ever do in life is listen. I did not forget what I was going to say. That pause was to get you to say, okay, what is it? Tell us, what's the most important thing? You put up this anticipation. So think about the reality shows. And tonight, two of them have sung, but only one of them is going to go home the champion. And the winner is commercial break. You see that pause and the commercial break builds up anticipation, and then they tell you. And there's even music. Dun, 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 dun. And so you want that live silence. Now the negative type is the one that we most often do if we're honest, and that's dead silent. This is the pause that we give because we simply have lost our place. We have a brain freeze and we can't think about what we're going to say next. We stumble, maybe we're reading off a manuscript and we look up to give that great eye contact, and when we look back down, we lost our place, and we have this pause. We naturally are going to have those dead silence, those pauses. The key is to minimize, one, the frequency of them, and two, the duration. A 1 second pause is different than a 3 second pause. So the longer the pause, and after a while you begin to panic and you have to apologize or forgive me, I lost my place. But if it's a 1 second, if it's a quick thing, you can almost recover from that and do it in such a smooth way that people don't know that it was a pause. Once again, something I learned in spoken word. The fact that you don't have this manuscript in front of you, you don't have this poem in front of you, so you don't know if I've messed up. So if and I would normally do it without paper, I memorize my spoken word. If I mess up and forget something, I'm not going to say, oh, my bad, I forgot. I will literally I'll pause, act like it's part of it, like I'm thinking, and I'll come back in. Or I'll quickly, my brain will switch, and I'll go into a freestyle, and I'll say some stuff from the top of my head, make up some stuff until I can get back on track, and then I'll pick back up where I left off. But the key thing I'll never do is give a disclaimer or apology or say I messed up. I play it off to the death. I don't think I've ever messed up to that point where I had to start all over or had to say something to the crowd. And even then, I'll probably try to play it off and maybe say it was all part of the act. I don't know. I don't think I've ever done it. But I have had some pauses that I've had to strategically cover up. And so you want to try to minimize the dead silence and you want to utilize the live silence. Next, you want to strive for vocal variety. You don't want to be monotone. You don't want to have the same volume, the same pitch. So we just talked about volume, we talked about pitch, we talked about rate. You want to vary those things. You don't want to speak at the same rate all the time. You want to speak at the same pitch. You don't want to speak at the same volume. You want to vary those things throughout, because that in and of itself gives different meaning to different parts, or different emphasis. You emphasize certain things differently. And so you want to have a varied vocal variety. You don't want to be monotone. You don't want to just be here, but you want to give us some of this. That's important. You want to make sure you have good pronunciation. You want to pronounce your words correctly. Speaking, which is by definition, speaking words according to the standard grammar usage, the standard English usage. For example, when you look in the dictionary, or most dictionaries, even online, they'll show you how to pronounce the word phonetically. It'll show you if it's supposed to be A versus A or O versus A. It'll show you how many syllables are in the word if you're going to pronounce the word correctly. For example, when I put down there athlete versus athlete, some people sometimes say athlete. They add an extra syllable in there. Does it change the definition? No. Does the listener know exactly what they're saying? Yes. But can it maybe give you a ding on your credibility as far as your intelligence? Possibly. And so when in doubt, just make sure you're trying to pronounce the words the way that they're supposed to be pronounced. And if you happen to mispronounce words, make it obvious of why you're mispronouncing those words. So I think about, once again, in hip-hop spoken word, we have this thing called poetic license. And maybe you take a word and you slightly change how it's pronounced in order that it would fit what you're trying to do. So maybe if you want the word to rhyme, but it doesn't totally rhyme, you pronounce in a way that it rhymes a little bit better. And no one will call you out on it if they have a true understanding of the art form, because they'll know that you're taking poetic license. To take license means you take liberty. You are allowed to do some things you normally can't do. So allow me to do something that I normally shouldn't do, which is mispronounce this word, but just know that I'm doing it on purpose. But you got to do it in a way that you don't have to explain that you're doing it on purpose. People just get it. And that could be adding extra syllables too. It could be maybe changing the ending of, like, from a SK to a X, like ask versus ax. It could be that for poetic license. And speaking of ax versus ax, articulation is saying words clearly. So not just simply saying words according to how they're supposed to be pronounced according to standard English. Maybe it's just making sure you say them clearly. When we get to talking really fast, sometimes we don't say things clearly. Our articulation gets compromised. What do you mean? Versus what do you mean? Each word has its own space. What do you mean? What do you mean? So when we used to sing the ABCs, elemental P isn't a pronunciation issue, because I clearly pronounced L like it was supposed to be. L is L. And I said L. And I said M. And I said NOP. But I put them all to make it seem like it was one letter called elemental P. That's an articulation issue. Slowing down, giving each letter its space, making sure if the word ends in SK, that we ask versus ax. Did you ask her out on a date? No, I did not chop her up. She is still living. I did not ask her out. That's a issue of articulation. So you want to make sure we articulate our words correctly. Duration is very important when it comes to oral interpretation. This is how long we hold the sounds, the letters, the words. So when I speak, especially if I'm preaching every now and then, or if I was doing spoken word, I may say something to the effect like, it is important that we learn. So I draw that out, learn. Sometimes I was doing hip hop and rap, I would clip stuff. Learn. I would clip it because I need to hear him get the next word based upon the flow of the rap. So say if a beat, some beats allow me to draw out my words so I could say them a little bit slower at the end. And then I call on my friend. Certain beats allow you where you got to clip it at the end. Call out the friend. That way you can go to the next. Where should I begin? So you got time to draw your words out based upon the flow. And so sometimes you can clip your words, shorten them up a little. Sometimes you can draw them out. And you do that for emphasis, but you also do that to establish a certain rhythm. So that's the duration. And then lastly, in terms of voice, is we should use any dialect that we're going to use. We should use that with care. Use it sparingly. So like I said, this is public speaking meets theater. So maybe you want to perform your literature as a character, an Irish person. Or maybe, say for example, if you were reading a text that had some urban language in it. I'm not a big fan of the term Ebonics. I'm not sure exactly what Ebonics is. You know, I know what it's supposed to be. I'm not sure if I totally agree with the concept. And say if you were reading this and you were starting to read it like this, yeah, you know what I'm saying, and I was going down, you doing, doing with your hands and what you're doing with your voice. That's allowable, but the advice is to do that with care, because sometimes we can make caricatures and be offensive when we overdo those types of things. Or we may do it with a certain dialect or a certain accent, and we may do a poor job. Sometimes when I try to speak with a Jamaican accent, patois, and yeah man, come down to me odd. I can get away with it to the average person, but if I spoke to the average Jamaican, they'd be like, man, it's just you're faking. That's just not a good accent. And so we can use it, but use it sparingly, use it with care. All right? That is just about it. And I want to conclude by looking at some things we should do in terms of our body. Because it's not just simply good enough that we're going to be using our voice when we do oral interpretation. Another part of the interpretation, and part of how we communicate the meaning to the audience, is what we do with our body. So here are a couple of things I want you to keep in mind. Pay attention, be cognizant to your body language. We may be so focused on what the words are coming out of our mouth and how we say what we say that we're not cognizant of the fact that we're doing things with our body that may or may not affirm what we were just saying. In some ways, it may actually contradict what we were saying, go against what we were just saying. And if you agree with the adage that seeing is believing, that means people are going to go with what they see your body doing versus what they hear your words saying. And so make sure that we are paying attention to our very own body language and that we're using that strategically to get our point across. Here's some things we can do. Animate those facial expressions. So if you're wanting to portray your text through your new interpretation as this being something that's exciting, we should see excitement on your face. Something sorrowful, we should see sorrowful on your face. Now, once again, going back to what I was talking about, the dialect, the same thing with the facial expression and the body language, we want to make it pronounced, but we don't want to overdo it to where it becomes a caricature, where just like, I am so happy. No, you want to keep it natural, but you also want to make it big enough that people can see, because if you're performing this, you got to make sure the people in the first row can see it, the people in the back row can see it also, but you want to make it realistic. And so an analogy I have is sometimes looking at when the Batman trilogy came out, the Dark Knight trilogy. What was so cool about that compared to maybe some of the earlier Batman movies and even some of the other DC and Marvel stuff is that I'm not sure what the exact term for it, but the directors desire to keep it kind of grounded in reality. So none of the characters had superpowers. So it wasn't Superman. So Batman's a normal person who had some gadgets, who got trained by the League of Shadows. That's how he learned how to get his martial arts on and things of that nature. And he used his wealth to build some gadgets. And then he went to the R&D at the Wayne Enterprises and got his Batmobile and things of that nature. Joker was just a normal dude who was kind of psycho and face got a little bit damaged. Bane wasn't the super hyped up Bane from the comics, the Matt Hardy Bane. He was just real buff, had the apparatus because of some breathing issues, but it didn't necessarily, he wasn't being pumped with these chemicals that made him really big like in the other one. And so on and so forth. And it gave a sense of reality. So the characters had some traits that made them who they were, but those traits weren't so over the top that it made it kind of like, that's kind of whack. So same with oral interpretation, you want to animate your face, but you don't want it to become a caricature so over the top. You want to still keep that realism. You want that eye contact. You want to use eye contact to really connect with your audience. The gestures, what you're doing with your hands, and then your overall body movement, where you're placing yourself. Do you sit? Do you stand? Do you walk? Are you pacing back and forth? Do you do things with your hands? Do you point? Think the things that you do to communicate the meaning. All those things are going to be very important in oral interpretation. If you put your hands behind your back and stand still, you should be doing it for a strategic reason. You're trying to communicate something through this. This is serious. This is professional. This is stern. So everything we do and don't do with our body should be communicating something. Pay attention to how we dress, because your interpretation of the text and what you're trying to communicate to the audience can be portrayed in your dress. When in doubt, you could dress down if you're trying to communicate that. Dress up if you're trying to communicate something. Or dress the part. Meaning, get into the character. So if you're doing something that allows you to have to dress up like almost like a costume, do that also. Do whatever you need to do in order to have your appearance communicate the meaning to your audience. And then lastly, the same way we would practice delivery with our vocal delivery, make sure we're practicing delivery with our body language also. Plan it out. Have a strategy. When I say this, I'm going to point. At this point, I'm going to put my hands like this and go like this to let people know I'm thinking, and then I'm going to sit down to communicate something, but I'm going to burst up real quick and hit my hand like that to let them know I'm doing. Have a strategy, have a plan about what you're going to do. Don't just wing it. Even if it means on your manuscript or on the script that you get from this song, whatever, you may write in the margins, point right here. Close your eyes right here. Look down right here. All those things help communicate the meaning. All right, so this has been our chapter on oral interpretation. I want you to, hopefully you've listened to this video. Now I want you to head over to the discussion board to answer that discussion question. And then I want you to begin to have this stuff begin to percolate in your mind, because that's going to be our next speech. We're going to take a already written song and do our very own oral interpretation of that song. We're not going to sing the song. We're not going to do a cover. We're going to speak the song, but we're going to speak in a way that we communicate a different meaning, a different ethos, a different emotion. A different pathos to that particular song. And so, hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Take care, and I will see you all Wednesday on Zoom, where we would have an opportunity to discuss this speech in greater detail, as well as to discuss some of what you discussed in the discussion question that I'm going to upload. Take care and God bless.